Hi Twitch, and welcome back. I'm here with Chris from Travelex, and we'll be talking about how to build PCI compliant applications with containers on AWS. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
No problem.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and Travelex for those of us that haven't heard of it before?
Sure. So I'm currently head of infrastructure architecture at Travelex. Prior to that, I was DevOps lead for about 2.5 years. I was responsible for all of the net new infrastructure that we built on AWS, which is an infrastructure that supports our container-based PaaS, primarily used for delivering international payment services as part of the Wire product.
So I feel like PCI compliance is often a really scary term for people. Can you tell me a little bit about what's required by PCI and then what goes into building PCI compliant apps? That face, I think,
sure.
is a common face.
Yeah, it's like, you've just asked me for defining a very large control framework and talking through all of the details. PCI is a blessing and a curse, mostly a curse. The compliance framework is very prescriptive and detailed, which is actually good for somebody who's trying to implement it, because it's very clear what you have to do and what you don't have to do. The thing that's bad about it, especially these days, is that when PCI touches something, then everything that touches that then becomes in scope as well, and its scope grows like a fungus. It's unpleasant. And we set out, as everybody does, to minimize our PCI scope as much as possible.
So I know that part of PCI is, so I also did PCI compliance work because everyone at some point I feel like is in a situation where they're working with PCI.
Yeah.
And I know that a lot of it too is how do you store data for both compliance reasons so that in case of an audit you have everything, and that also data that's maybe a little bit warmer that you can perform like actual actions and analytics on. How do you build that in for your infrastructure?
Well, with Amazon we cheated really. We used Postgres and RDS for all of our data tier, because Postgres for RDS sits inside your attestation of compliance for PCI, and so all of the controls from the infrastructure up to the database user level, that's all handled for us by someone else. And from my perspective as infrastructure architect, I see making as much of compliance somebody else's problem the most important thing. You know, give us a very narrow focus for us to do our compliance work on, and let everything else be handled by Amazon, really.
Yeah, I think too. Let's take a step back, and can you? Well, I think that's a theme, by the way, of like how can I let this be someone else's problem so that you don't have to worry about everything, because there's lots of stuff to worry about, and there's lots that goes into PCI compliance, so you don't have to do all of it. And then, can you take us a step back and give us a little bit of an overview of what your architecture looks like?
Sure, and this will involve some hand-waving air diagrams. I hope that's okay.
I am all for hand-waving diagrams.
Okay. So, we have a REST API fulfilled by microservices, all scheduled out of ECS. And we do ECS by the numbers, or at least ECS by the numbers from about 2 years ago. So we use load balancers for service, and load balancers and private DNS for service discovery. And then all of those microservices sit behind an API gateway pattern, not Amazon's API gateway, unfortunately. We use Nginx in a container to act as a reverse proxy into those microservices. And so that's our PaaS bit in a nutshell. And then in terms of relational data storage, we use Postgres on RDS. For queuing, we use Amazon's SQS service. For email outbound, we use Amazon's email gateway, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we try and consume as much of Amazon's infrastructure as a service as possible. Again, like we were talking about, to kind of minimize that operational overhead, because we have a small team who looks after this.
That's the same approach I would have done too. I mean, manage the least amount of things myself as possible, so that the things that I do really need to manage that make me different, that set me apart from other people, I can spend more of my energy on it instead of the stuff that I don't have to reinvent.
Absolutely. Like I said, now my job title is Head of Infrastructure Architecture. Architecture is fantastic. It's like a holiday. I get to have opinions about everything and no accountability. my infrastructure architecture principles. Principle number 1 is Travelex is a business about selling foreign currency. Anything that we do that isn't to do with selling foreign currency, that should be somebody else's problem. And so when that comes to infrastructure, we should be looking at SaaS, serverless, containers, all of these new and emerging technologies that help us focus on selling foreign currency instead of maintaining a horrific legacy IT estate.
That's like it's something that I think a lot of other people should be keeping in mind too, right? That anything that's that's directly helping me do what my company's job is, so selling foreign currency, anything that's not directly contributing to that, I don't want to do it.
Absolutely.
So with PCI compliance in mind, do you have any tips for people that are just getting started building PCI compliant applications? Any kind of tips to help them get started in the right direction?
Yeah, I think definitely the starting point is talk to your QSA and make sure that they are coming along on the journey with you. We were lucky in that, the QSA is the PCI auditor, right? So with PCI, you have somebody who's qualified, who has a certificate, who comes through and audits all of your things. They need to be a partner in the process of adopting services on public cloud. You need to include them and help them guide you as much as anything else, because they're the guys who rubber stamp at the end and say, yes, compliant. And we were lucky in that our PCI auditors, our QSA, was amenable to that way of working. And then the second thing is that Amazon have all of your audit artifacts available on the Amazon Artifact service. And so you can go to that, you can get the attestation of compliance that shows which services are covered, and you can give that to your QSA and say, right, this is the start of a 10. And it's not a free lunch by any stretch, because with the shared accountability model, Amazon's responsible for so much, and then you're responsible for everything else. So you've still got this bit to audit. But yeah, I mean, that would be my starting point. Get the QSA on board, get them involved in what you're doing, use the attestation of compliance to support that, and off we go.
Can you, I've seen a lot of just kind of, not actual questions, but a lot of chatter in the chat about GDPR.
Yeah. Yes, another base.
You made another face for that.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to how GDPR kind of plays into all of this, or how have you guys had to change to work around GDPR? I'm also American, so I'm not an expert on GDPR. We're really great at data privacy.
Well, there is a point about that, incidentally, which is GDPR is legislation that covers European citizens' data. Doesn't matter whether it's in America or in Frankfurt or London. It's still in scope for GDPR. And some organizations I know have had challenges with that, like ICANN in the US. Has been in the press quite a lot.
Obviously, we're the example.
Yeah, it's something, well, if you're starting, it's something that you should work in. I mean, when we started 2.5-3 years ago with the ECS work that we did at Travelex, we were talking about working in security as a sort of a first-class citizen. As we test everything, obviously, because testing is part of everything we do. We assess everything in terms of security because that's part of everything we do. Now, privacy-driven design is a new thing that people should consider. And I know I've made friends in my InfoSec and compliance team by saying, yes, we are privacy-centric design now. We're thinking about these things from the start, not at the end of the project.
And that's like a really wide-reaching piece of legislation too, because it's not just data stored in Europe; it's any European citizen's data. That's like an incredibly wide-reaching piece of legislation.
Yes, GDPR is a monster.
So it's something we'll all have to be thinking about a lot more if we haven't. If you're not thinking about it now, I think you got to start thinking about it pretty soon.
Yep.
Can you speak a little bit about? You guys work a lot with containers at Travelex. Can you talk a little bit to why you've gone with containers and how the role that they've played in your architecture and why you've gone with them?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So when I started 3 years ago, I had a very, very small infrastructure team of me, and I had multiple competing teams all wanting to deploy different technology stacks. I had Java, Python, Scala, all of these different things.
You make the best faces, by the way. I love them.
Java deserves it. It really does. It's not 10 iterations to catch up with where Python was 10 years ago. I mean, forget it. Anyway, it's one of these topics one of these triggered topics that we shouldn't talk about. The point was that I had lots of competing demands, and I had lots of very eager technology teams, and I desperately didn't want to be responsible for any of the sort of middleware that you have to put up with, the frameworks, performance of Jetty and Tomcat. I don't want to be responsible for any of that. And Docker specifically is a fantastic way of encapsulating all of those services dependencies, those technology dependencies, and making them somebody else's problem. Or, sorry, let's be more DevOps about this. It means that your application developers can be responsible for the middleware and the technical approach and everything that they want to use. And so when you look at your operational model, you say, right, well, instead of having a middleware team who only support IIS, which is where we were, you can say, no. Our application developers want to take this technology approach for implementing this service or this business capability. Let them do that. Here's Docker. This will wrap up all those dependencies. Let them manage that. And we can run it on a Mac locally to test it out. We can redeploy it into a container scheduler, and whether that's a non-production or a production environment, all of the basic bits and bobs that you need. Those are things that start life with the developers in a simple local working environment, rather than something that has to go through approvals around 6 different teams.
I went for really similar reasons too, right? Really small operations team, and everyone always has a language or a tool or a framework that they want to use. And maybe my favorite part about containers is that they don't care what's inside them. Once I've built them, I can put them anywhere I want.
Yes. I mean, there's still a little bit of balance to that.
For sure.
Because if you can put anything you want inside a Docker container, inevitably people will, and so there's a positive tension between sort of architecture standards and compliance and this kind of thing. Say no, we need to use this set of technology so that we can support it, and because it's got a consistent security profile that we can manage, versus the developers going, yeah, no, I'm going to learn Golang this week.
Sorry, I have 2 questions from Twitch. The first one is, how stable has ECS and Docker been for Travelex versus, say, a more traditional deployment like EC2 plus AMI plus auto-scaling group, assuming an extremely large scale?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So we run the EC2 instances that sit underneath ECS on Spot Fleet exclusively, and we do that in production and non-production environments. So all of our instances that underpin our infrastructure have a 2-minute termination notice on them, and the availability of those underpinning infrastructure components is managed by AWS as part of Spot Fleet. So hopefully that gives you an indication of our posture in terms of resilience. I mean, when we chose ECS and containers, part of what we were trying to do, part of what we were designing to, was a resilience story. I mean, for us, compliance is number 1. No, wait, security is number 1, compliance is number 2, resilience is number 3, and performance is down in the toilet somewhere. We do a small number of high-value transactions for international payments. You're never going to do tens of thousands of transactions a second. So our focus is very much on resilience and security. Having invested a lot of time and effort into designing an infrastructure whereby any system component is allowed to fail, so a container is allowed to fail, we have multiple behind a load balancer, a server is allowed to fail, we have multiple in a Spot Fleet. Well, let's exploit that resilience to do immutable servers, to do all of these other kinds of things.
I have another question that it's a little bit more broad, but can you go into more details on what it means to be secure by design? And then I'm going to add a second part to that, which is how can I work with containers in a way that is secure by design?
Right. So yeah, I mean, security by design is a bit fluffy, isn't it? I mean, I guess it's it's something where you need to work into your team's, and again, this is all going to be super fluffy stuff, right? Because it's not about the technology so much as it's about the people and the way that they work together, right? So if you imagine a typical software development team, 20 years ago, cranking software out is like, that's great. These days, it's like, well, if you're not cranking out software with good test evidence and coverage and a CI/CD pipeline, then you're not really doing your job properly. So when we talk about secure by design, what we're saying is, those people, as they work together, both in terms of software development and infrastructure development, they need to be considering security as a first-class entity, as part of the definition of done in your sprint, or however your development process works, rather than a feature on a backlog that is prioritized in amongst all of the other stuff that the team has to deliver. Because no product manager really cares about the long-term security of the thing you're trying to deliver. And so you have to work it into that definition of done.
I think they do care from a different perspective too, right? Because you can have the coolest product in the world, but if it's not safe to put my information there, then people won't want to use it. So it ends up being on like the customer obsession side of it too, right? Which is that even if it's not the most glamorous thing to work on, you build from it with it. You build including it from the beginning, because otherwise no one will use it.
Sure, and you can make security glamorous, right? When you're talking about security and Docker together, the area of scanning containers for vulnerabilities and managing that takes you immediately outside the sort of bread and butter security tools that you might have. And I find that interesting. I don't know about everyone else. It means that you can work in security tools into your continuous delivery pipeline, especially if you're working with Docker. So for example, you take your code, you compile it, you test it, you put that inside a container, then you put your container through static analysis, API fuzzing, like OWASP Zap application proxy to scan for vulnerabilities. You can do a whole bunch of stuff like that before you end up with a tested and security tested deliverable, which then goes into your PaaS automated deployment, whatever it is.
My one thing to add there too is that the smaller and more minimal your container is, the less of an attack vector there is. So you don't include packages that you don't know where they came from. Don't include random third-party binaries, for example, that maybe you found off the internet that looked kind of cool. Not that I've done that, which I probably have, but like the less stuff you have in there, the less stuff there is to attack.
And you can have a lovely time with that. I mean, we did. I mean, because you end up with a container pipeline where you have a full-blown Linux distro in a container, which cross-compiles a load of stuff into, or at least sets a prefix differently into a separate subdirectory, and then do a from-scratch container that just uses that. This is how we build our API gateway, for example. So essentially, all of your build time dependencies are in one container, and your deployment container has the bare minimum that's required to run. And so from an attack surface, it's very, 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 very small. But your whole build process is containerized, which means that putting that on whatever CI/CD platform you want to is easy.
A question from Twitch says, do you do contract testing on your Docker containers before deployment?
Yeah, that's a little bit outside of my purview in infrastructure. Our back-end engineers get very excitable about contract testing. Actually, the bits that I know about this process, we do stand up our entire container cluster on a single very large EC2 host temporarily as part of our testing of new features. And I know that contract testing is part of our testing of new features. So maybe, I think is probably the short answer.
It's a good answer. So Twitch has gone off topic, talking about edge gateways. So you guys have 5 more minutes-ish, so if you have a question on Twitch and you're looking to talk to Chris from Travelex, let us know in the next couple of minutes. So put your questions in chat. So with a couple more minutes left, what do you see as next for you guys? What do you think kind of your next challenge to tackle is? Where's the next place that you think you could optimize or make things a little bit better?
I think our biggest challenges at the moment are scaling in terms of teams who want to deploy services onto our the platform that we've built, and also which is mostly breaking down tooling and making sure that we're actually doing microservices properly and that each service is truly independent of the others, and generally progressing along a maturity curve, which means that we treat versions seriously and don't just make stuff up as we go along. I think the other challenge that we have is scaling things internationally, because Travelex is an international business, and we are focused predominantly in the Dublin region at the moment in terms of our application tier, and as soon as you spread that internationally, you run smack bang into compliance challenges, latency challenges, or how you undo that, deployment challenges, all of this kind of stuff.
So it's definitely more of the problems that everyone kind of has as they grow, right? Which is how can I be in more regions, but you, I think, have something that you always have to think about in the back of your mind too, which is how do I build and also keep compliance in mind?
Exactly, exactly.
Do you have any maybe some last tips for folks that are kind of in the same boat? So how do you scale and keep kind of your compliance and security as your top 2 priorities?
Yeah, I think as usual, the tips aren't about technology really. It's about people and processes.
Which are legitimate tips.
We got a huge amount of value out of having a full-time member of the compliance team and a full-time member of the InfoSec team sat with the digital engineering group that were trying to deliver these products and services. Because instead of having to go through a rigmarole of talking to somebody to get an answer, we had somebody right there who could be authoritative. And also, we could educate them on, why is public cloud a benefit to our compliance posture rather than a detractor to it? Why can we get away with this with containers, and why is that not a problem? And here is a white paper that explains the security model in great detail and all this kind of thing.
I love white papers. I think a theme for you, for Travelex too, seems to have been to treat everything as a partnership from the beginning. So work with your resources both internally and externally so that you're all on the same page from the beginning instead of, well, I built this and now my compliance person doesn't like it.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so I think we are just about out of time. Thanks for joining us today, and we will be back for more on twitch.tv/AWS from the AWS Summit in London. I'm Abby, and this has been Chris. Chris, thanks for joining me.
No problem.